Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing without objection so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection so ordered. And as a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purposes of an opening statement for 5 minutes. At almost 145,000 route miles, the United States has one of the most efficient and comprehensive freight rail systems in the world. It is also one of the safest. The benefits of this system aren't just measured in miles and tons of freight shipped. They can also be measured in other benefits, including reduced fuel consumption and associated emissions reductions. Rail is capable of transporting a ton of freight for more than 450 miles on only 1 gallon, that's right, just 1 gallon of diesel fuel. Unfortunately, the Biden administration and the state of California remain intent on pushing an unwanted, radical Green New Deal agenda on the American people, regardless of the costs and consequences to our economic and national security. While this hearing has been called to discuss the California Air Resource Board's request for authorization for a state-based regulation, we should be very mindful that this proposed regulation is not just confined to California. It's national in both impact and intent. According to CARB's own analysis, the rule would require both BNSF and Union Pacific to replace their entire fleet of locomotives nationwide to comply with the regulation, which will cost billions, with a B, billions of dollars, and will make freight transportation and the cost of goods drastically more expensive. We are also concerned about the rule's impact on the short line operations, which Mr. Rivera will highlight for us in his testimony. As the United States rail transportation system is intrinsically linked and vital to be safe and efficient movement of freight and passengers in interstate commerce, other rail operators would also be forced to adjust their own operations. The importance of rail transportation is so great that Congress has enacted a number of statutes specifically designed to ensure the preservation of this most important mode of transportation. For example, railroads were the first American industry to be regulated under the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Many of my colleagues who served in last Congress are familiar with the Railroad Labor Act of 1927, which was designed to avoid the potential for economically crippling disruptions in interstate commerce caused by labor disputes. Additionally, the Staggers Rail Act of 1980 was enacted to restore the economic health of the industry at a time when the railroads were at a verge of bankruptcy due to the stifling economic government regulation. The very same type of economic burden CARB and the Biden administration is seeking to reimpose. Further, the Interstate Commerce Committee Termination Act created the Surface Transportation Board and explicitly, quote, preempts all state laws that may reasonably be said to have the effect of managing or governing rail transportation. That's the end quote. Finally, there is the Clean Air Act itself, which clearly establishes the federal government acting as the sole regulator of emissions from new locomotives. Unfortunately, this CARB request for authorization is an attempt to circumvent the statutory and legal requirements of both the Clean Air Act and the Administrative Procedures Act. Concerningly, falsely considering a matter of this scope as a waiver instead of an agency rule also denies its coverage under the Small Business Regulatory Efficiency Act and the Congressional Review Act. Moreover, CARB's proposal would fail any meaningful cost-benefit analysis. It also fails to fully consider costs associated with the acquisition of still non-existent, and I am going to repeat this point, non-existent zero-emissions locomotives. The cost of building out, much less permitting the necessary infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, is likewise erroneous. It is for these reasons that a broad coalition of railroads, shippers, and union organizations have come out in strong opposition to this rule. This regulation must be rejected by EPA and accompanied by a return to sanity in both Sacramento and right here in Washington, D.C. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the challenges and opportunities for commuter rail service, as well as best practices to improve service, realize efficiencies, and increase fare revenues. I now will recognize the chairman of the full committee. I will now recognize the ranking member Larson of the full committee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. You're getting ahead of yourself. I want to thank Chair Nels and the committee for holding this hearing on railroad locomotive emissions, and I want to commend the Chair on setting a date as well for a rail safety hearing. Now that the NTSB has released its report after the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Congress has to act on NTSB's recommendations to enhance rail safety. Today's hearing addresses how Congress can continue to support freight movement, grow our economy, and reduce emissions from the transportation network. In Washington State, freight is key to long-term economic growth. Nearly 1 in 2 jobs statewide is freight dependent, with almost 40% of states' wages generated by freight dependent industries. According to Washington State Department of Transportation, Washington State's multimodal freight system handles almost 600 million tons of cargo each year, which is valued at $677 billion. In 2022, 15% of freight tonnage was moved by rail in my state, including through rail yards in Everett and Bellingham in my district. So while transportation, including freight rail, keeps the economy and supply chains moving, the sector continues to be the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation emissions are trending in the wrong direction. For example, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions increased 1.6% from 2022 to 23. According to my own state's Department of Ecology, diesel exhaust is one of the most harmful air pollutants. Diesel exhaust puts healthy people, including more than 4 million people who live and work near diesel emission sources in my state, at risk for respiratory diseases and complicates health conditions for people with asthma, heart, and lung disease. And some of this was running through my mind on Saturday when a diesel locomotive was parked just below my place in Everett, Washington, and spit out diesel emissions for 7 straight hours. Thankfully, Washington State's a leader on reducing emissions in transportation. In 2020, Washington enacted its motor vehicle emission standards law, which is helping increase the number of zero-emission vehicles on state roads. Washington's ferry system, the largest in the country, yet also the largest source of transportation emissions statewide, is transitioning to a cleaner and greener passenger ferry fleet. Washington's Maritime Blue Initiative invests in thriving, world-class, and sustainable maritime industry for the next 30 years. For example, my state's work on maritime batteries resulted in a brand new Corvus Energy facility at the Port of Bellingham, which opened last year. Corvus's expansion in Northwest Washington State illustrates the growing regional and global demand for hybrid power and zero-emission energy solutions to transportation needs. Washington State expects to meet its emissions goals for 2030, but more needs to be done to reach our 2040 and 2050 goals for a cleaner and greener future. Congress and the administration want to be partners in this. Thanks to the BIL, communities in my district and in districts across the country are investing in a cleaner and greener future. Last month, the U.S. DOT awarded the Port of Bellingham a nearly $18 million raise grant to modernize a shipping terminal site, returning the site to a fully functioning multimodal terminal with more efficient loading and unloading of rail cars on the terminal, an investment that will reduce emissions while keeping supply chains and the maritime economy moving in Northwest Washington and the West Coast. Congress has also invested more than $5 billion in Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements, or CRISI grants, in the BIL. These grants can be used to purchase updated rail locomotives, and short-line railroads can directly apply for grants rather than going through public agencies or entities. The BIL also specifically allows recipients to use CRISI to rehabilitate, remanufacture, procure, or overhaul locomotives, provided that such activities result in a significant reduction in emissions. The Federal Railroad Administration is currently reviewing applications for $2.4 billion in CRISI funds, an investment that can fund quite a few new locomotives in communities across the country. So I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about how they're working to build a cleaner and greener freight rail network. And with that, yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ranking Member Wilson for 5 minutes for an opening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. For many, railroad tracks in this country have too often existed as a symbol of division, inequity, and a legacy of racial oppression. In the aftermath of slavery, and as a result of redlining, Black communities and other underserved communities formed settlements near rail lines. Even though these areas were polluted with hazardous locomotive emissions, which we now know are associated with disease and premature death, they settled there because they had nowhere else to go. This is why when I would ask some of my constituents, where do you live? Where do you work? And where do you go to school? They often respond with across the tracks, which serves not just as an answer, but a statement of the persisting injustice and disproportionate burdens placed on so many communities of color. The California Air Resource Board, or CARB, is working to limit harmful emissions from locomotives, including by requiring cleaner engines after 2030 and reducing the time locomotives spend idling. CARB estimates that these efforts would save $32 billion in health costs and prevent over 3,200 premature deaths in California. This regulation seeks to steer the railroad industry towards doing its part to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Every year, extreme weather events strike with increasing frequency and severity at sea levels as sea levels continue to rise. For the residents of my district who live in South Florida, these threats are not just concerning, they are existential. We have seen constant flooding in South Florida recently, and seas are projected to rise in Miami-Dade County by over a foot within the next 30 years, dramatically increasing flood risk further and threatening the homes and livelihoods of frontline communities. Just last week, we had our first Category 5 hurricane in the Caribbean, the earliest ever in hurricane season. It is now more important than ever that we protect California's right to implement nation-leading regulations. The industry's response to this regulation should not be to sue CARB. We have had national Tier 4 locomotive standards in place since 2015, which the industry seems to have avoided implementing for over 90% of its locomotives. The technology exists. What is missing is the investment, the will, and the commitment to ending the legacy of railroad communities suffocating under the deadly effects of air pollution. It is only this commitment that may begin to make the phrase across the tracks a phrase of the past. In today's hearing, I look forward to learning what the railroad industry is doing to improve our air quality and the health of communities living near rail yards. Mr. Chair, the United States Climate Alliance recently submitted a letter to EPA Administrator Reagan supporting the deployment of zero-emission technologies across all transportation modes. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to add this letter to the record.
Without objection.
And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the letters and statements for record from the Associated Builders and Contractors, the Fertilizer Institute, the American Railroad Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Pelican Institute for Public Policy, the Taxpayer Protection Alliance, and a joint letter from the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association, as well as the National Industrial Transportation League, and a joint letter from the National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association and the California Construction and Industrial Materials Association. These letters, without objection, so ordered. I would like to, again, welcome our witnesses and thank you. Thank you all for being here today. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, obviously. Yellow means you're running out of time, and red means to please conclude your remarks. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included into the record without objection so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection so ordered. And as your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, I will recognize Representative Duarte of California to introduce Mr. Dylan Olvera.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today, and thank you for inviting Mr. Dylan Oliveira, one of my constituents, to testify on behalf of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. Mr. Oliveira is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Modesto and Empire Traction Company, also known as MET, a short line railroad operator situated in a bustling 2,000-acre industrial park known as the Beard Industrial District in Modesto, California. That includes globally recognized companies such as E&J Gallo Winery, Del Monte Foods, Nestle, Frito-Lay, Plastipac, Graham Packaging, and our local Stanislaus Foods. MET also maintains over 53 miles of track, helping integrate California's 13th congressional district into the North American supply chain, including Mexico and Canada, through connections with BNSF and the Union Pacific Railroad. Mr. Chairman, I'll discuss it more when it's my time for questions, but I'm very appreciative of Mr. Olvera being here today. He can speak with credible fluency as to the harmful real-world implications of CARB's rule. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Thank you, Mr. Duarte. With that, Mr. Oliveira, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony. Turn it.
Thank you, Congressman Duarte. Good afternoon. My name is Dylan Olvera, and I'm the President and CEO of Modesto and Empire Traction Company, affectionately called the MET. As a member of the Short Line Railroad Association, I am pleased to represent our nation's small freight railroad community. The MET is a private, family-owned business established in 1911. We have 50 employees and are a Class 3 short line railroad that provides rail service to approximately 30 customers in Modesto, California. The Central Valley is home to some of the nation's most important food and agricultural shippers, and our railroad provides the first and last mile of service to those customers. We are fortunate to connect to 2 Class 1 railroads, the Union Pacific and the BNSF. California short lines move roughly 260,000 carloads of freight each year, and the MET represents 35,000 of these carloads. Each carload carries the equivalent of 3 to 4 trucks worth of goods. California short lines operate approximately 200 locomotives, and our railroad represents 11 of those. Most short lines equip their fleets with low-cost but reliable and easy-to-maintain older second-hand locomotives acquired from larger Class 1s. This practical model is in compliance with federal law, has been in place for decades, and allows short lines to survive. Short line locomotives over 23 years old, which would soon be banned under the CARB rule, are in fact the norm in the industry. These locomotives cost only a few $100,000s, while new Tier 4 locomotives cost a few $1 million each. Railroads are already environmentally friendly. According to EPA data, the nation's freight railroads account for less than 2% of transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, and short lines make up only a tiny fraction of that 2%. Our trucking competitors, meanwhile, account for 23% of transportation greenhouse gas emissions. The MET has already made great strides in reducing emissions, and we were an early adopter of clean locomotives. Beginning in 2008, our company worked closely with California to apply for state grants. 9 of our 11 locomotives were upgraded from Tier 0 to Tier 3 due to this work. There are 3 different grants in place today that have obligations that will be completed through 2032. The total cost of these upgrades was $12.5 million, shared between California and the MET. These locomotives have many years of remaining useful life, but would have to be scrapped and replaced with new locomotives per the CARB regulation. This CARB regulation will also force the Met to contribute to a spending account while continuing to complete our grant obligation. This is an unreasonable ask to make of any small business. Our current calculation for the spending account is over $1 million annually. Our grant match and the spending account emission fees would represent a massive increase in our locomotive spend compared to historical levels. We also recently applied and were awarded CRISI grant funding to upgrade 2 switch engine locomotives from Tier 0 to Tier 4. The total cost for this upgrade is approximately $5 million, again, to be split between the federal government and the Met. As we have demonstrated, the Met and short lines in general are perfectly willing to work with CARB and other similar agencies to reduce emissions when they offer reasonable paths forward, but this rule is just not feasible for short lines. The CARB regulation will cause a significant financial impact to the entire short line industry. Railroads are capital intensive and our margins are tight. A well-run short line frequently spends over 80% of revenue on operating expenses, and contract provisions and market competition will prevent us from raising prices to cover CARB's regulation costs. If short lines are driven out of business due to CARB's infeasible rule, that freight will move on to trucks, increase traffic congestion, and freight cost, and businesses will have lost vehicle shipping options, viable shipping options, and move out of California or just vanish. The EPA should deny CARB's authorization request. Not only does it mandate the use of locomotive technology that is not currently commercially available, CARB has also publicly acknowledged that the massive compliance costs will force short lines out of business. This would have a catastrophic impact on our freight rail network, the U.S. supply chain, and the environment and highway safety. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Oliveira. I now recognize Mr. Nober for 5 minutes for your testimony. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Subcommittee Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Wilson, Full Committee Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Roger Nober, and I am honored to be back testifying on the important topic of today's hearing, an examination of issues related to CARB's in-use locomotive regulations. Earlier this week, I submitted my full written testimony and will not repeat it now. But today, I'd like to draw on my background, my experiences on this committee as the lead staffer on the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act of 1994, as well as subsequently chairing the Surface Transportation Board and then as an executive vice president at BNSF Railway, and focus on 3 main points from my written testimony. First, provide you all with a brief history of the Interstate Commerce Act preemption provisions. Second, explain why I believe the CARB regulations, whether or not authorized by EPA under Section 209 of the Clean Air Act, are preempted by the Interstate Commerce Act. And third, review effective, non-preempted alternatives for lowering locomotive emissions and improving air quality in California today. So let's turn to the Interstate Commerce Act preemption. Section 10501 of the Interstate Commerce Act broadly preempts both state and federal laws or regulations that affect rates, classifications, rules, practices, route services, and the facilities of such carriers. This provision was intentionally written to be extremely broad and reflects the bipartisan desire of committee members to ensure that railroads were exclusively regulated in those areas at the federal level. Importantly, the section preempted other federal laws as well. Over the past 30 years, Section 10501 has been read broadly, although not literally. State and local laws that might be preempted from applying to railroads, like sanitation codes and environmental reviews, have been found to still apply to them. But state efforts to regulate railroad operations through creative actions such as those we are reviewing today have been disallowed. When another federal law is thought to conflict with Section 10501, the STB or courts will attempt to harmonize the laws or regulations. If they cannot be harmonized, then the conflicting federal law will be preempted. All right, so turning to the CARB in-use locomotive rules, in my view, the CARB regulations are unequivocally preempted by Section 10501. I come to this conclusion when considering the following: the plain language of Section 10501 and its clear and unambiguous intent, the fact that CARB has petitioned the EPA to open a Tier 5 locomotive rulemaking, and while the EPA has not yet done so, it is still studying the issue, the broad intent and scope of the CARB regulations, and that they effectively apply to equipment entering California and not just equipment local to California. The practical infeasibility of creating a California-only locomotive fleet means that the CARB regulations would become de facto national standards. There's the technical and commercial infeasibility of zero emissions technology and the CARB regulations timelines and the uncertainty created by two progress evaluations. The attempt by CARB to influence equipment manufacturer through definition of in-use and the reality that conforming locomotives do not yet feasibly exist. The economic impact of and the penalty-like nature of spending, and as Mr. Olvera just mentioned, the impossibility of small railroads' compliance with these requirements. I also believe that, were EPA to grant CARB Section 209 petition, the CARB regulations could not be harmonized with the Interstate Commerce Act and would be preempted. As a matter of statutory construction, Section 10501 is the later enactment of law. That Section 209E is more specific is not important here. A later enacted broad preemption provision need not list every statute that it might apply to. So what are the alternatives? CARB in its testimony has indicated that the legal prohibitions that give locomotives a, quote, free pass and conclude that railroads need to do their part to improve air quality in California. And I absolutely agree. Locomotive emissions should be reduced, but not on a national and not on a state basis. Going forward, the best step long-term would be an EPA Tier 5 regulation. CARB, as I said, has sought such a rulemaking as recently as 2017, and EPA has not refused to do so. While a Tier 5 rulemaking might be slow and laborious, EPA would also consider the national implications of such a rule and, in balance, improving emissions profiles with mode and route shifts that nationally might increase overall emissions exposure to more people. In the short term, CARB and local air quality districts in California could also negotiate voluntary agreements with railroads. These agencies for decades understood the value of voluntary agreements to reduce locomotive emissions, and they produce real benefits to California residents, and I believe that they could again. In conclusion, I believe that these regulations are legally preempted and substantively the wrong way to reduce locomotive emissions. I ask the committee not to lose sight of the larger picture, which is that rail is the most environmentally friendly mode of surface transportation. As a result, locomotive emissions regulation should not let the perfect, which is adopting unavailable zero emissions technology by a date certain and penalizing those who don't, be the enemy of the outstanding, which is moving as much freight on rail as possible using the most efficient rail equipment commercially feasible. So thank you again for inviting me to testify this afternoon, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Nober. Mr. Yall, you are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on this important topic. My name is Ural Yal. I'm a Senior Vice President at Flatiron Construction and a Vice President of Highway and Transportation Division at AGC, Associate General Contractors of California. With nearly 900 members specializing in all facets of construction, at AGC of California, we believe the construction industry is vital to the success of California. We're passionate about shaping policy, improving our state's infrastructure, and developing our workforce. My firm, Flatiron Construction, is a national infrastructure contractor founded in Colorado in 1947, and we've been operating in California since 1989. With more than 3,500 craft and professional employees, 1,100 of those are in California, we work for public and private clients to deliver essential infrastructure. Our yearly revenues exceed $2.5 billion, and more than $1 billion is generated in California. We have worked with passenger and freight rail operators throughout our history, with notable projects such as the 68-mile segment of California High-Speed Rail, Redlands Passenger Rail Project in San Bernardino County, North Coast Corridor Program in San Diego that serves joint Amtrak and BNSF lines, intermodal facility improvements, rail operation and safety improvements, such as grade separations and double tracking on passenger and freight rail lines across California and several other states. As a contractor that self-performs majority of our work with our own craft workforce, and with rail and transit construction being a major part of our business, maintaining investments in infrastructure spending is very important to us. A more environmentally friendly nation starts with our state and federal agency partners' ability to build while maintaining jobs, ensuring stable material pricing, meeting effective transportation needs, and securing the funding required to build the projects our communities need. The construction industry not only creates jobs, but also drives economic growth by developing the infrastructure necessary for a sustainable future. While AGC of California supports the goal of a more environmentally friendly state, the California Air Resource Board in-use locomotive regulation, if granted, will have significant adverse effects on infrastructure development, construction supply chain, and job creation. One reason for this adverse effect is available funding. The proposed spending account and useful life requirement within CARB's in-use locomotive regulation presents significant financial and operational challenges for our agency partners and operators. These requirements are designed to accelerate the transition to zero-emission locomotives by mandating substantial financial contributions from operators into a spending account and limiting the operational life of existing locomotives. While we support the intent to reduce emissions, these measures impose undue burdens on our transportation agencies and, by extension, the communities they serve. We are concerned that this regulation will have unintended consequences and jeopardize planned infrastructure projects and construction jobs. Another aspect of this regulation is the potential impacts on construction costs. The costs of construction have gone up, including cost of construction materials, construction labor, and transportation of materials. Since February 2020, the average cost of construction materials has increased by 39%, a rate that is nearly twice as high as the rate of consumer inflation, with notable increases of over 60% or more in diesel and milled steel products. The CARB in-use locomotive regulation would further increase these costs and the cost to rebuild the nation's infrastructure, further diminishing what can be built with available funding. Majority of AGC of California members rely on sustained infrastructure funding to keep and develop our workforce and sustain our businesses. Given the already strained funding and infrastructure due to supply chain and inflationary pressures, resulting in the recent downscaling of projects due to lack of funding, CARB's in-use locomotive regulation will result in further impacts to our industry. Thank you for allowing me to testify today, and I'm ready to happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Yall. Ms. Arenas, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me today. Chair Randolph asked that I pass along her apologies for not being able to attend. I'm Heather Arias, the Transportation and Toxics Division Chief. My team is the team that developed the locomotive rule that we're discussing today. I also have teams who have developed and are implementing regulations for engines all across California's transportation system. But today, we are focused on the locomotive regulation. Locomotives are one of the largest sources of criteria pollutants in California. 90% of California railroads are within 1 mile of vulnerable residential communities already highly impacted by nitrogen oxide, or NOx, and toxic diesel particulate matter, of which there is no known safe level of exposure. Reduction of the pollution caused by locomotives operating in the state is critical for California to meet its Clean Air Act obligations. Locomotives represents 31% of the NOx reductions needed in California's state implementation plan strategy to meet attainment under the Clean Air Act for highly polluted air basins such as South Coast and San Joaquin. Locomotives are not entitled to a free pass, and like other regulated industries, railroads operating in California must reduce emissions that are harming Californians. Railroad operations in California continue to use and are increasing use of some of the oldest and most polluting engines in California. Although Tier 4 engines have been available since 2015, railroads have continued to operate locomotives in California with emission control technologies over 20 years old. Technologies that produce over 80% more emissions than the current US EPA Tier 4 emission standard. Even worse, railroads continue to operate locomotives in California that are up to 50 years old with no emission controls at all. And in the past several years, the average emissions of their locomotive fleets operating in California have gotten worse, not better. California has been taking robust steps pursuant to the Clean Air Act to reduce emissions from other mobile sources, including heavy-duty trucks, passenger cars, off-road equipment, ships docked in California's ports, and more. Locomotives are increasingly the outlier. Today, when comparing the transportation of the same number of shipping containers, locomotives produce more NOx and toxic diesel particulate matter than trucks operating in the state. And soon, locomotives will produce more greenhouse gas emissions than trucks on a per shipping container basis. In 2023, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, adopted a locomotive regulation that is estimated to result in $32 billion in health savings to Californians by preventing 3,200 premature deaths and 1,500 emergency room visits and hospitalizations. The reg would also decrease cancer risk from exposure to locomotive emissions by up to 90%. CARB's locomotive regulation follows California's expressly preserved authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate emissions from locomotives operating in the state. It does not set emission standards on new locomotives, nor does it mandate the purchase or use of zero-emission locomotives. Operators may continue to operate Tier 4 locomotives for decades to come, and because nearly every locomotive operating today runs on fully electric motors and could be powered using a fuel source other than its diesel generators, operators may continue using their existing locomotives by configuring them to run on zero-emission power sources. The regulation allows ample time for emission control technologies to continue to advance and for market efficiencies to put downward pressure on prices. It is important to note that zero-emission rail transportation is nothing new. Electrified rail is more than 100 years old, and we once had electrified tracks throughout the nation, coast to coast. Advances in battery and hydrogen fuel technology have given railroads more options than 100 years ago. It is saddening and disappointing that railroads remain some of the top polluters in the state, given all the tools available to them to do better. California passenger vehicles, heavy-duty trucks, ocean-going vessels, and heavy off-road equipment, among other emission sectors, are all doing their part. All we ask is that the railroads do their part too, so Californians can have clean air to breathe. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony. We will now turn to questions for the panel. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. And Mr. Oliveira, according to CARB's own analysis, short line and regional railroads will not be able to comply, won't be able to comply with the cost of the regulation and would cease to operate. I think short lines operate on routes that Class 1s pretty much, they abandoned them, right? They abandoned them. So did CARB consider the unique business structure of short lines?
So many short lines in the state of California have very small operations. They operate on very thin margins and don't have the financial wherewithal to invest in Tier 4 and ultimately zero-emission locomotives, even with state and federal funding. Our railroad consists of 11 locomotives, 9 of which we proactively signed up for clean air locomotives back in 2008, invested millions of dollars along with the state of California, but now well before the useful lives of those locomotives are over, we're being asked to scrap them and upgrade to more expensive Tier 4 locomotives and put money into a spending account in the tune of about $1 million annually. Those types of financial requirements really don't fit the financial model of my short line or any others.
Very well, thank you. Mr. Nober, is it more accurate to describe this proposed rule as one that regulates new locomotive engines and emission controls and not just the use of locomotives?
I think the regulation as technically written really it says it only applies to in use, but I think that it's twisting the definition a little bit of in use because you can't use anything that hasn't been manufactured. Sure. So I would say that the clear goal is to incent and to create and to force manufacturers to be able to produce locomotives that can meet these emission standards or that become zero emission standards. Sure. So it is, as a practical matter, regulating manufacture.
Sure. On the question of locomotive use, the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act and the various Surface Transportation Board decisions and court rulings have found that state and other attempts to regulate railroad operations are preempted by federal law. And as former chairman of the STB, should EPA follow the STB's recommendations and conduct its preemptive analysis and consider interpreting and applying CAA narrowly so as to avoid conflict with the ICCTA?
I mean, clearly, in the first blush, and I don't think it's 100% clear whether the STB alone in a court or the STB and the EPA alone could apply harmonization analysis. But the EPA certainly has the ability to look at the two statutes and decide whether one is in conflict with another, and we certainly would, I would, if they asked me, I would advocate that they do that.
Sure. Finally, in pursuing the regulation of locomotives via a waiver, EPA avoids statutes like the Congressional Review Act or the impaneling of Small Business Advocacy Panel under the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act. Shouldn't a proposal of this consequence, at a minimum, be conducted as an Administrative Procedure Act rule so the CRA and the SUBREFA apply?
Well, as now a scholar of regulatory process, I strongly believe that significant actions like this should be done under the most Administrative Procedures Act process, which in this case would be to either do a full rulemaking, which would have notice and comment. Now, they did open a proceeding and people did comment, including many folks who are in the audience and myself. But that legal obligation to consider those comments and then to, again, have it be subject to the Congressional Review Act and cost-benefit analysis and many of the other portions of it would be different if it were a full rulemaking. So the more that it is a rulemaking, the more process there is, and the stronger outcome it will be.
Very well. And Mr. Yell, California AGC is a member of the Rebuild SoCal Partnership, which represents 2,750 contractors and over 90,000 union workers. This group wrote in opposition to the CARB rule for many of the reasons you stated in your testimony, sir. Would it be fair to say that the CARB rule jeopardizes the Barstow Gateway project in San Bernardino County?
Yes, that's correct. That's a very large project that's planned by BNSF in that area. It's a big economic engine. It's one of the biggest mega projects in the area, and it's jeopardized by this.
Yeah. And that's not what we should be doing here. I want to thank you all. I yield back to balance. I now recognize Ranking Member Wilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Arias, communities living near railroads and rail lines, which are most often historically underserved communities, are routinely exposed to high levels of air pollution and emissions stemming from the burning of diesel fuels. In just your state, CARB estimates that reducing locomotive emissions would prevent 3,200 premature deaths and save $32 billion in healthcare costs. What are the steps that railroads could immediately make to reduce emissions in these communities?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, we are currently working with the rail lines. In fact, I want to actually applaud the Class 3 lines because they are taking immediate steps by, as mentioned earlier, applying for funds. They are coming forward. There are 200 Class 3 engines in our state. 30 of those engines are currently under applications for state or federal fund. So that is a great step to make progress immediately. There are other things that could be done as far as maximizing use of the newer engines. There are things like ensuring that the engines idle the least amount as possible. There are things like working to utilize cleaner technology in the other equipment that's at the railroads. So there are things that can be done now. We've also ensured that there are different pathways in the regs so that if any one of the industries have a different idea that may actually incentivize cleaner technology sooner, they can come to us and work with us on alternative compliance plan and get credit earlier, and which allows for other opportunities later.
Can you tell us or synthesize for us how important it is to reduce emissions from locomotives?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. As far as locomotives are concerned in California, as the Clean Air Act, as I mentioned earlier, does have requirements for attainment across the state. The locomotives are 1/3 of our emissions necessary to meet that federal requirement. Outside of that, our state has also identified diesel as a toxic air contaminant in the late 90s. The diesel engines that are running throughout the state are contaminating the nearby neighborhoods. If this rule were to go into place, we would see a 90% reduction from the current diesel exposure to those communities.
Thank you. Diesel emissions are known to create higher health risks, childhood asthma, and cancer. Tier 4 locomotives have 90% lower particulate matter emissions and 80% lower nitrogen oxides emissions than a Tier 2 locomotive. How many Tier 4 locomotives do Class 1 railroads operate?
Great question, ma'am. We only have data from UP and BNSF regarding locomotives that come into the South Coast Air Basin. We do not know what their total national fleet is. They have mentioned that they have a lot of Tier 4s. They have said many of them are parked. We have asked multiple times how many they have, and we do not have that data.
What can you tell us if railroads will be in compliance with this regulation if they operate Tier 4 locomotives or remanufacture existing locomotives to Tier 4 standards?
If they operated Tier 4 locomotives, they would certainly make a huge dent in their requirement. Ultimately, over many decades, the goal is to transition to zero-emission operations. What could be done even today is a reconfiguration of their existing engines. So they wouldn't necessarily have to change the engine to a Tier 4. So for example, if they're operating a Tier 1 or Tier 2, some of the much older engines that we discussed, they could reconfigure that engine because the locomotive you see that's going down the line is actually all electric. There is a smaller diesel generator on that train that's providing the power. They can reconfigure that to allow for zero-emission operation. There's tender cars or catenary that can do that. That could make that engine a hybrid engine, similar to what you've seen in cars for many, many years. That hybrid engine could operate in zero-emission operations in our state and even in other communities to remove or eliminate the diesel health exposure issue. That can happen today. Those technologies are available today. They're for sale today.
Wow, thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nober, the California Air Resources Board claims railroads should do their part when it comes to emissions reductions, which sounds like a pretty subjective mission statement to me. Your testimony points out that if such regulations are necessary, then EPA should open a proceeding. Can you talk about why that's important and what the fundamental differences between agency rulemaking and the waiver process is?
Well, a waiver process is, strictly speaking, what's called an adjudication. So it's CARB coming in and asking for the agency to take an action with respect to that request. So CARB is standing as if they were any other applicant for something, and parties go to agencies and ask for waivers of rules all the time. A notice and comment rulemaking is doing a rule of general applicability, and that's one that it's published in the Federal Register. Now, this was too. You open a docket, the agency has an obligation to put out a notice of proposed rulemaking. They then have to take comments, they have to respond to every comment. The rule has to then, since it's EPA, would have to, if it's a major rule, would have to go to OMB. It would have to have a cost-benefit analysis. And most importantly, I think a rule would be able to evaluate national impacts. So the issue that I would have as a matter of practice here is that CARB, as a California state agency, its legal obligation, and I may be wrong, Ms. Arias may correct me here, but is to look at impacts in the state of California. And EPA, let's say that the effect of this was to create mode shift so that ships would go farther and go to Houston or Savannah, and that more is going on truck, and that more cargo that is now going by rail through Southern California is going in other places. That might increase diesel emissions to people in other parts of the country. EPA in a rulemaking would have to look at that, and in a waiver proceeding, that those kinds of questions would be discretionary. You wouldn't automatically have to look at them.
So it's a much more thorough process.
Absolutely, and it certainly can be more time-consuming than a waiver process, without a doubt. And probably most stakeholders would be frustrated with the amount of time that most agencies took to do rules. But there's a plus and a minus to that. Now, a Tier 5, a new national locomotive standard would probably take a significant amount of time longer, because they would have to study different technologies, different feasibilities, and make a national assessment on overall, the ability to roll them out. And locomotives are difficult. I've seen one of the reasons probably there aren't that many Tier 4 locomotives is that they performed poorly in the beginning when they first came out. Only one manufacturer has ever been able to even produce Tier 4 locomotives. There's 2 locomotive manufacturers, and one of them was never able to produce a Tier 4 locomotive, and the ones that have performed very poorly for many years. And so those become disincentives, I think, to carriers perhaps investing more in them.
Mr. Yao, moving on slightly, what kind of supply chain disruptions is this going to cause, and what about the effect on inflation? How's this going to affect shippers?
A lot of construction materials certainly come through rail, and any disruption into rail transportation traffic is going to impact our supply chain, both on the length of the projects because of delay times in getting the materials, as well as the cost of the materials due to the increased cost in transportation. What happens if there are disruptions in rail traffic is that starts to shift towards truck traffic, which then has also impacts on costs, the timeliness, and honestly, there's a lot of shortage in the trucking industry currently already that we're experiencing. That's just going to overload the system and cause more impacts to us.
Thank you. Ms. Arias, I can't help but ask this question. I was in California a couple years ago, and the smoke from the forest fires, I mean, you could hardly see from one end to the other. Not a very pleasant environment to be in. I understand more than 1 million acres of forest in California is burned in recent years. Is this a focus of your agency at all? It just seems to me like you got a lot of carbon hitting the atmosphere, and if there were a few preventive measures that were put in place, you could prevent a lot of those forest fires from happening. I think if you looked at all the carbon from forest fires versus everything else, it wouldn't even be close. Any thought to that, or any studies, or any work on that front?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. As a matter of fact, absolutely. The state is looking at all of the emissions, including forest fires. It has been such an important issue that our legislators have also been very involved, and lots of different actions have been passed. We are happy to follow up with you if that would be helpful, to provide a list of actions that the state has done. But absolutely a very critical reduction strategy, as all of this is. We have to make sure that we get reductions across the board.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Olvera, I once worked for a smaller railroad than yours. Now, I wasn't running the books. I was running engines and on a track crew, so I can't speak exactly to the numbers, but it seemed like the railway was barely scraping by, with, of course, hardly any help from the government, in stark contrast to the trucking industry, which runs on roads and highways entirely subsidized by the American taxpayer. Now, you said that your railroad buys used locomotives, most of which don't meet these standards. What effect would buying brand new Tier 4 or zero-emission locomotives have on your business?
Sure. New Tier 4 locomotives cost millions of dollars a piece. Most short lines operate on locomotives that cost a few $100,000 a piece. My railroad actually purchased Tier 3 locomotives that were about $1.5 million a piece back in 2008 and have an extensive amount of useful life left. To be forced in a very abrupt timeline to scrap those Tier 3s and move to Tier 4s would require about $1 million, with federal and or state funding, would require about $1 million from our railroad for each locomotive. And with that, if we were able to comply other safety type projects such as track enhancement and crossing enhancement would have to be deferred in order to meet that standard. It'd be very difficult to comply with.
I'm actually amazed your railroad would still be able to stay in business, because there are a lot of railroads that simply wouldn't be in business if that were the case. You noted in your testimony that California short lines move about 260,000 carloads of freight annually. Each carload carries the equivalent of 3 to 4 trucks worth of goods. So this means that short lines in California alone keep about 1 million trucks annually off the highway. Is that right? Is that the right number?
Yeah, that's correct. So one rail carload typically equates to 3 or 4 truck carloads. And so 260,000 times 3 to 4 would be that number, north of 1 million. A lot of the short lines, just on an individual basis in the state of California, move thousands of carloads. My railroad moves 35,000 carloads annually. If those carloads were to be switched on truck and on our roads, that would result in about 120,000 trucks annually on the roads versus on rail.
And will that increase emissions?
Absolutely. Through congestion, traffic congestion, and current gashouse emission percentages, trucks today emit 23% of greenhouse gas emissions, while railroads emit in total 2%. And short lines actually are a small fraction of the 2%, so the emissions would immediately be impacted.
The CARB report actually predicts the fall of the short line industry because of the prohibitive costs of the proposed regulations, noting it is possible some of these businesses would be eliminated. Cost burdens from the rule on small business operators could range from 42% to 208% of their annual revenues. You can't run a business when your costs go up 208% of your annual revenues. Ms. Aria, Europe is well ahead of the United States on climate policy, as I'm sure you well know, and their transportation policy is focused on mode shift. What does mode shift mean in this context?
Yeah, we are not interested in shifting the freight from rail to trucks. We absolutely understand the necessity to have both modes in our state. We do have the largest ports in the nation. We are also a huge producer of agricultural products for the nation. We must have all modes of freight to be able to move all of that and serve
Okay, but
the
if you
nation.
care about emissions, as
Yes, sir.
Europe does,
Yes.
you should know what their policy is with mode shift. And their mode shift policy is very deliberately to get trucks off the highways and move those freight moves to rail, because it's more efficient, because it produces fewer emissions. So Europe, which is ahead of us on climate policy, and look, I'm a Democrat. I care about climate policy. I believe in the science. I want to reduce emissions. But if your rule shifts more traffic from rail to trucks, it will do the opposite of your intention. It'll actually raise emissions, which is why Europe has a policy explicitly in the opposite direction. So let's come up with a policy that shifts traffic off of trucks onto the railroads. It will not only be better for emissions, it'll be better for public safety, because accident rates, deaths from accidents on rail are much smaller than by truck. That's the policy that we need. California is going to spend about $30 billion this year subsidizing highways. If you came up with a policy to electrify railroads, you might have a winner. But this seems like a loser to me. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Lamont for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. Ms. Arias, when you talk about early on in your conversation that within 1 mile of the tracks is 90% of the emissions, but don't we have to acknowledge when towns were first built and settled, they were either along the coast with ports, they're along rivers, and with the advent of railroads across the country, towns located right next to the railroad, because in any case, they want major sources of transportation to move freight, people, et cetera. And so kind of implied with what you're saying is that maybe all towns need to be at least 1 mile away from railroad tracks to not have emissions. And then you have to acknowledge too that sometimes the rails were there, sometimes the airport was there first, that property is cheaper next to those, is not as desirable, and so they move homes into those areas that only because they're cheap and people with lower incomes can afford to move into them. So whose fault is it really that people live near these areas, developers or people that choose to buy homes in these areas? We have to look at that on the other side. So, Ms. Arias, when CARB fully acknowledges that people are going to go out of business, especially short line railroads, which are an important integral part of what the long lines can't do and what we don't, what Mr. Moulton was even talking about, do we want to shift this to trucks? How can you, in good faith, develop a policy that you fully acknowledge is going to put an important sector out of business and at the end of the day, drive up emissions? How does that work?
Thank you for the question, sir. As it relates to the analysis that we have in our report, that report does not take into account any sort of the incentive programs or other opportunities we might be able to work with the Class 3 railroads. As mentioned earlier, there has been a significant application pool this year to help the Class 3s get to compliant engines. In addition, we intend to support them and work with them to continue to seek those fundings as we're moving forward.
Okay,
We're
let me-
also specifically talking to each of the class lines individually and trying to determine what is the cheapest and easiest way for them to move through the regulation as
Okay,
well.
let me stop you there, because maybe there is no way for them to move through the regulation. There are small outfits. They don't make a ton of money in order to change this technology. Mr. Olvera, or Mr. Nober as well, when they talk about availability of Tier 4 engines, which, my stats here show me that if we're at Tier 4 engines, if you just took a breath for a minute at CARB and let everybody come up to Tier 4, you've achieving 85 to 90% cleaner versus older technology. That sounds like a win to me, but you're already jumping ahead to 5 or 6 or all electric. And Ms. Arias, you're saying like, well, we can take this diesel engine out of a Tier 3 or 2 or whatever, and we'll put this newer one in. You don't say that we're going to put a new diesel engine in. You're talking about putting an all-electric thing that doesn't even exist yet. How does that work? Because I want Mr. Nober and Mr. Olvera to talk about that for a moment. How is the Tier 4 availability of those engines coming along here? Can we even replace everything with Tier 4 at this moment? Because Ms. Arias said that it was new technology as of about 2015. That's
Yeah,
only a few years ago. We expect all these things have been changed to Tier 4 by now.
Tier 4 engines are limited in availability, and with locomotives or railroads requiring their locomotives to all upgrade in an abrupt time frame, that limited inventory is going to be taken over very quickly.
So we're jumping past Tier 4 with this mandate, right? We haven't even filled out Tier 4 availability. They want 5 or 6 or whatever number you want to call it, right?
Yeah, there's very few locomotives in the short line industry that are at Tier 4 level. My railroad was one of the pioneers jumping to Tier 3 engines starting in 2008. At the time, that was the best available or highest tier available, but Tier 4 is just getting started.
Well, it's a lot like the trucks in California. They say, hey, get up to this newest tier from 2011 or newer, and you'll be fine for a long time. Then wham, they change the regs, and those trucks are now have to be phased out by 2030. Same with people in good faith trying to do their local. Mr. Nober, touch on that too, please, with Tier 4 availability and the massive, 85, 90% cleaner if we were just all at Tier 4.
Well, as Mr. Lowell, as I indicated before, when Tier 4s were first required, it took a long time to iron out the operational issues with them, and only one manufacturer has ever actually been able to produce working Tier 4 locomotives.
Currently.
When they first came out, then again, there were many problems with them, and they kept breaking down. And for a railroad, at least at BNSF where I used to work, they have to operate in Arizona in 120 degrees in the summer, in Montana and minus 50 in the winter, on a 24/7 basis. And if there's a failure, that becomes a significant issue in a network industry. And so reliability is a very important factor, I think.
Thank you. And here we are jumping past a tier that isn't even ready yet with new regs with non-diesel engines, right?
I don't think that there are, I mean, again, I'm not a locomotive expert, but I
Well,
don't
the
believe that there are
requirements. I gotta yield
feasible, I don't
back.
think that there are feasible locomotives that
I
even.
got to reclaim my time, sir. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yes, the
Chairman.
gentleman yields. Thank you so very much. Mr. Carson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Arias, opponents of California and EPA's clean air standards complain about the costs of compliance as a burden to business profits. But for a valid analysis, there should be a review of the benefits compared to the costs. Yet, I'm not hearing anybody really talk about the cost to human health and well-being in the long term and short term, especially of the damage of unchecked air emissions. This is especially a problem with disproportionately negative impacts on minority communities and minority works, quite frankly. Please describe some of the health dangers and costs of failing to fix these toxic emissions.
Thank you, sir. When it comes to our regulation, there are multiple health impacts, including premature death, hospitalizations, asthma, lost work days, on and on, heart issues, it goes on and on. When we did our regulation, we are required to provide an analysis to our board with all the information that we have. We were able to provide a cost of the rule to industry, which we've mentioned, of $13.8 billion. We were also able to provide to the board of what we call a monetized health benefit, which is the cost to Californians on their health as we achieve the rule. We were able to calculate that the benefits of this rule would be $32 billion for Californians. So $13.8 billion cost to industry to comply, and we as Californians would save $32 billion. We also added into the rule a cost should the whole fleet have to turn over nationwide. That cost would be $86 billion is our best estimate. We do not have the data to be able to provide you and the other members what the monetized health benefits would be. If you could compel UP and BNSF to give that to us, we'd be happy to do that. But on our best estimate, we believe that this rule could provide 200 to 300 billion health benefits to the nation for just one line, one class UP and BNSF, not all of them.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. There's a consistent message from this administration that electrification is good for the environment. However, my good friend, Mr. Westerman, challenged Secretary of the Department of Transportation 2 weeks ago on whether it really is the most clean and efficient pathway forward. While Secretary Buttigieg and other elites can endorse electrification and feel good driving their EVs, it's really concerning that these people just shut their eyes and ears off to the world around them. Because electrification comes at a cost, and the supply chain to get the end product is full of pollution and human suffering. I'm talking about child slave labor to get the cobalt for those batteries. We know without question that 33% of the cobalt is mined by child slave labor, and that's a fact. Nobody disputes that. 15 of the 19 mines in the Congo, owned by the Chinese Communist Party, use child slave labor. 0 environmental standards and 0 labor standards. Well, Secretary Buttigieg admitted that child slave labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo for critical minerals needed for electrification is wrong, and he committed to eliminating such horrors in our supply chain. The Secretary has not once called on the President to rescind the MOU with the DRC. It makes you wonder where the priorities really are. But I digress. But we really can't talk about electrification until we are willing to have an honest conversation about the supply chain in its entirety. Mr. Nober, you made an interesting observation in your testimony about the CARB rule, similar to the one I just made on electrification as a whole, that certain decisions can make one group feel like they're making a good decision, yet completely neglect the fact that it comes at a great cost. Can you speak about the increased emissions we would likely see as a result of this rule?
Well, Mr. Stauber, I think that, just to that point, CARB, when they talk, they did talk about the health benefits to Californians and the cost in California, and then estimated health benefits nationwide, which could only come if their regulations forced railroads to adopt those technology nationwide. The other alternative, though, is not to adopt technology that doesn't exist nationwide, but instead to divert cargo that currently goes through California to other states. So if cargo comes in and it goes by truck, that creates congestion. The congestion on both California roads and wherever else it might go is going to create pollution. And then if cargo goes on ships longer, it goes to the Gulf Coast and it goes to the East Coast, or it goes to other states on the West Coast or to Mexico and Canada, then it's going to travel longer, and then those emissions have to be looked at as well. So yes, there are health benefits nationwide if all locomotives were zero emissions, but there aren't nationwide zero emission locomotives, and my understanding is that they're not going to be for a very long time. And instead, if you looked at increased truck traffic and increased rail traffic by other communities, would that offset the benefits? And that's what a nationwide rulemaking would look at. What is the effect of mode shift? And try to model that. I don't know what would happen.
Thank you.
But you have to look at that.
Thank you. Mr. Olvera, when you saw the CARB analysis noting that there would likely be elimination of businesses like yours, what was your reaction, and did the analysis feel flippant or apathetic?
Yeah, I was obviously concerned for my railroad, who employs 50 people in our community, but most of our customers employ thousands of folks in our community. I think the elimination of a cost-effective and efficient rail freight option to our shippers, our customers, would increase their cost and alter their businesses as well, possibly jeopardize job opportunities in our community.
I would tell you that in just the last couple of seconds I have left, I think that, Ms. Arias, you have a tough job selling California standards to the rest of the nation. I've been here going on 6 years, and I want nothing to do with California. I've had an expert sit in that same chair and tell me in northern Minnesota that me and my constituents have to take more scooters to work. It's 35 below. We're not taking scooters to work and from work. This is the problem. We have one state that tries to force this upon our great nation. In fact, oftentimes, we look at California and do just the opposite. Just the opposite. I think I really do believe you're well-intentioned, but I don't agree with the philosophy and how you're going about it. Mr. Olvera just said he would lose 60 workers if they shut him down, and other tier 1 suppliers. This is about jobs and economy. And you know what? You can follow the rules, meet the emissions, and it will still not be good enough for some people. You will still punish those railroads and other small businesses across this nation that want to do right. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I recognize Ms. Foshee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here with us today. Recently, Innovative Rail Technologies announced that it will deliver the first of 2 battery electric switcher locomotives for operational use in Hertford County, North Carolina, in 2024 as part of a public-private partnership between the county and the Nucor Steel Corporation. Ms. Arias, can you speak to the current state of zero-emissions locomotives development, and can you also touch on ways the railroad industry can work with CARB if it cannot meet the timeline set by the current regulation?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. There are today zero-emission locomotives available to be ordered, and in fact, UP, BNSF have ordered them. There are, in fact, switchers available today. There's one operating in our San Pedro port by PHL line, and in fact, they work with us to apply for 4 more. We know that today you can buy zero-emission tender cars so that you can do the reconfiguration that we talked about earlier. We know that catenary is available, and you can do the reconfiguration that we talked about earlier. There is zero-emission technology available today. We will continue to track it. We expect that it will continue to increase and costs will continue to go down. However, we also understand that that can be expensive. We understand that it may be harder for our smaller fleets like our Class 3s. We have built in several opportunities within the reg so that they can come talk to us, work with us on alternative compliance plans. If we are able to approve an alternative compliance plan, they will not have the spending account obligation. There's also an alternative fleet milestone option, which a lot of our passenger train fleets have noted that they will take advantage of. We believe it could also be an option. Same thing, if we are able to work with the fleets and figure out if that path works for them, they will not have the spending account obligation. We also have various extensions in the rule. We do have hardship extensions. We have extensions if the OEMs are not able to deliver on time. We have extensions for manufacturer issues if any of the other parts they cannot get on time. We have extensions for infrastructure. Last, we have reached out to each and every operator in our state and are trying to work with them one-on-one to ensure the least cost, most health benefit option moving forward so that we can get to zero emission in the least costly way and continue to transition our fleet as we've done with all the other fleets. California has been able to transition our freight to zero in many cases, and we want to continue to do that. And we've been able to do it in a very successful economic way.
So the EPA introduced Tier 4 locomotives emission standards nearly 2 decades ago, requiring that emissions of particulate matter and nitrogen oxide be reduced by about 90% from Tier 3 levels. Since then, Class 1 railroads seem to have avoided making substantial upgrades needed to reduce emissions, with only approximately 7% of active Class 1 locomotives being Tier 4. Can you speak to why Class 1 railroad companies have failed to make the investments needed to improve locomotive emissions after the current federal standards were enacted?
Thank you, ma'am. I wish I could speak to that. They have anecdotally told us multiple times that there are issues with Tier 4. Yet every time we ask for any sort of data or information as to what those issues are, we've never been able to receive it. So we can't answer for you what they perceive to be the issues as it relates to Tier 4 engines.
And one final question. Emissions from the railroad industry in the form of carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and particulate matter have significantly impacted the health of many vulnerable communities that live near rail yards and rail lines across the United States. What effect will CARB's in-use locomotive regulations have on the lives and health of these communities? A similar question that has been asked by a couple of my colleagues.
Yes, ma'am, thank you for that. The communities that are directly within a mile of the rail lines and the rail yards, 90% of those are disadvantaged communities, as you've mentioned. With this rule, the reduction of diesel of 90% reduction would reduce their cancer risk. On top of it, obviously, when we're starting to look at the regional aspects, the emissions from these engines don't stay just within 1 mile, unfortunately. They do impact the whole basin. That's where we start to look at the premature deaths, the hospital visits, the lost work days, all the other health benefits. But back to the communities that are within that 1 mile, they certainly, on top of all these other health benefits that we've mentioned, are a much higher risk of cancer due to this exposure to diesel every day and ongoing.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd observed that a number of my colleagues have talked about railroads today in really dark, I think starkly dark terms, in essence saying that their existence is a symbol of historic oppression to people of color. And Of course, I can't speak to everybody's experience or the experience of every community, but I can speak to my experience and the experience more generally of South Dakota. Growing up in Fort Pierre, I grew up near the railroad. Growing up or living in Vermilion, living in Mitchell, living in Pierre, in all of these towns, there was the railroad right close to my house. That wasn't a coincidence. That wasn't an accident. If you overlaid a historic map of where did the South Dakota towns go with where the railroad tracks had been built, you would find an almost perfect overlap. Every 10 miles, another town was formed because that's where the locomotives needed to fill up with water. People didn't move there because of oppression. They didn't view this railroad as a symbol of somebody hating them or trying to drag them down. They viewed the railroad as symbol of opportunity and economic activity. And I guess I just want to mention that to provide a little fuller picture of the historic impact of railroads on communities. Without railroads, there would be no South Dakota. And in fact, in South Dakota, when you look at those communities, the densest communities of people of color, that would generally be on our Native American reservations. They are not well served by rail, and they are almost without exception seeking investments in rail because they do not view that rail as a symbol of oppression. They view that rail as economic opportunity to lift themselves and their communities up. I just want to make sure we provide a fuller context before we move on. So we have a proposed rule before us that would, I think almost ridiculously, cause Class 1 railroads moving goods from South Dakota into California to, once they reach the California border, to stop, take off that locomotive, and instead get a new zero-emission locomotive. A zero-emission locomotive, which, despite some of the other claims we've had today, let's be clear, are not widely available in the commercial sense today. And in fact, we don't really know when they would be widely available. This is all very aspirational. There's also been some discussion about this cost-benefit analysis. Ms. Arias, give us a sense of the $86 billion impact that your agency calculated. Did that, what number did that put on the delays that would be felt as secondary and tertiary impacts up the supply chain?
Good question. We do not do analysis of secondary impacts to the supply chain. It solely calculates the cost should the UP and BNSF determine that they would need to replace the whole fleet.
Okay, so let's be clear. The assumption of your analysis is that this is not a regulation that impacts California. It's a regulation that impacts the entire United States. Or in essence, any place that's served by the UP and the BNSF. And I know, ma'am, you know enough about their networks to understand how incredibly far-reaching that is.
They have mentioned that they do not prioritize a fleet within the state, so we understand that. And
okay, so California is attempting to make a rule not that governs Californians, but that governs the United States of America. So I want to make sure that I understand what you said, ma'am. We have, because your analysis had a zero cost to supply chain impacts. I want to make sure I'm understanding what you said. Did you say that there's not a single instance of a Class 1 railroad providing you any information on the challenges of securing Tier 4 locomotives? Is that accurate? Not a single instance?
They have not given us any data to indicate what the actual issues are. They have anecdotally told us that there are issues with Tier 4, but every time we ask, we are not given the data as to what the issues are.
Okay, so they have not been forthcoming at all. They just
not.
speak in generalities.
They have not.
So if your evidentiary record is that thin, ma'am, how can you possibly promulgate this far-reaching rule that, by your own admission, governs America? I would hope my colleagues, now listen, we don't do it perfectly either, ma'am, but I would hope we would have a little bit heftier evidentiary record before we decided to govern our country with such a far-reaching decision. Mr. Nober, let's turn to you. I've talked a little bit about the constitutional sort of preemption issues. In 30 seconds, sir, what can you tell us?
Well, as I talked about in my testimony, the Interstate Commerce Act is intended specifically to preempt not just state regulation of rail operations, but other federal laws that have the effect of impacting rail operations and regulating them. And that's what would happen here. So you would either have to, the California actions would be, in my opinion, clearly preempted. And if the EPA authorized them, it's really to authorize in use in the state of California. They would have to declare an emergency. They would have to show that there were some other standards that they would have to meet. And then they, at the same time, they would also have to show that that could be harmonized with the Interstate Commerce Act, which I don't think they could. And just if I could add one more thing, in addition to towns being 10 miles apart in South Dakota, major towns are probably 90 miles apart, because that's how far you had to service a steam locomotive.
I yield.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. DeSaunier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This brings back some fond memories of when I served. Ms. Sars, I don't know if you were there when I was on the Air Resources Board.
I was, sir. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. I was a Republican then. I was appointed by Pete Wilson and served under 3 governors, 2 Republicans and a Democrat. And that was in an age where there was a different perspective, at least in the California Republican Party, and reminded that Richard Nixon signed the U.S. Clean Air Act, and Governor Ronald Reagan, signed the California Clean Air Act, which governs all of this that we're talking about. So, U.S. EPA, their standard reads, according to the Clean Air Act, signed by Richard Nixon, Section 209, state standards, EPA shall grant an authorization under Section 209 unless the administrator finds that California, quote, was arbitrary and capricious in its finding, that its standards are in the aggregate at least as protective or of public health and welfare as applicable to federal standards. Number 2, does not need such standards to meet compelling and extraordinary conditions, or that California's standards and accompanying enforcement procedures are not consistent with this section. Ms. Reyes, obviously you and your attorneys feel like you've made that criteria.
Yes, sir. We have put it in writing multiple times as to what we believe we have and how we have met those specific requirements. Certainly, this has not been an arbitrary effort. As you are very aware, we were working on trying to reduce emissions from rail even when you were on the board. This particular rulemaking has taken over 6 years to be able to bring to the CARB board for consideration. Certainly, the South Coast and San Joaquin air basins, as long as the toxic diesel contamination warrants and requires this legal action by us for the state. So we have, in fact, met all of the requirements as necessary and encourage EPA to approve our authorization as soon as possible.
And can you speak a little bit to the public health benefits of the rule?
Absolutely. The health benefits themselves are going to be a monetized health benefit of $32 billion just for the state of California. That compares to the $13.8 billion that we assume will cost industry. As you know, those costs are very conservative. They definitely could do it cheaper, but we don't want to underestimate. The monetized health benefits are also not all the benefits we know we will achieve. There are other benefits like cancer reduction that we are not currently able to monetize. All we can do is tell the board how much we will reduce the exposure, which in this case is 90%. So in reality, the monetized health benefits are certainly a lot higher. We just don't have the data to be able to provide that to the board.
And you were required to do those cost benefits, as I remember, during
Yes, we are.
Republican administrations by the California Clean Air Act.
Yes, we are. And it is reviewed by the Department of Finance independently before we take it to the board.
So in terms of the questions, with all due respect to my friend, the chairman, we already did that. And
Yes.
I would opine a higher level that would have been done under the federal law. I remember years ago sitting in hours in Southern California in the Valley on the diesel train idling rule and the EJ issues that the ranking member has brought up. And I remember a quote at those hearings saying, you could have spent money on compliance, meaning the industry, or you could have spent money on lobbyists and lawyers. And I would add a caveat to campaign contributions. That strikes me as what's going on here. Yes, there is a burden of the industry, and I recognize that as a former small business owner, but the cost, to my mind, is long overdue. The Valley particulate matter has been amongst the worst in the country. You made a comment in your opening comments about carbon. Yeah, that carbon is true, but particulate matter is what kills people. People die because of these emissions. The trucking industry didn't want to do it either. It took a long time. I remember sitting in those long hearings where the truckers drove around the EPA building in Sacramento for hours. And it was hard for small truckers, but we had them do it. So it only seems fair to me for those people who have invested in, as other stakeholders, in dealing with the public health issues and their cost of their business, that you are required to do it. Mr. Reyes, I have, just quickly, I have 4 refineries in the county I represent. 2 of them are changing to biodiesel. How soon can we expect that as a fuel that would help with this?
Yeah, we actually have been working on some data as it relates to drop-in fuel opportunities for the rail lines. We are interested in looking at that a little bit more. Again, it gets back to the alternative compliance plan option. None of the rail yards or none of the rail lines have come in and said that they're interested in that, but we certainly are interested in something that can be used now to achieve those additional reductions.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just comment, the petroleum companies believe they do have a model to comply and have biodiesel that will work in these locomotives.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Mann for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing. This has been very eye-opening. And, you know, this is why we do this. And you read the materials ahead of time, but it is very eye-opening to me to hear that there's a regulation that's trying to be rolled out in California that there's no way to comply with. Meanwhile, the intentions seem to be to roll this out to the rest of the country, of great concern, and that's why we need to have this hearing. You know, I represent a big ag district in Kansas. Kansas is home to 14 individual freight railroads that connect our manufacturers, our farmers, our producers, and our national resources to domestic and foreign customers. Kansas is home to a robust series of short line operators, with my district alone containing 7 operators and 1,777 miles of track. Not 1,776, 1,777 miles of track that facilitate rural communities, terminal operations around the Kansas City area, and the agriculture industries. Combined, these railroads have nearly 40 million tons of freight across Kansas annually and serve as an economic driver for our economy. Communities across Kansas have been important rail hubs for more than a century, and the implementation of the CARB rule would jeopardize the reliability and affordability of freight rail transportation and disrupt our supply chains in Kansas. It was mentioned earlier, and I think we've got to not overlook the fact that this rule will be inflationary. And there's all this talk about inflation. Well, one of the reasons is all of these rules and regulations that we have that just drives up costs. This will be inflationary and will be passed on to consumers. A few questions. First off, the first couple for you, Mr. Olvera. Please elaborate on the harmful effects that this rule will have on short line operators for you, and then if it's rolled out nationally, and specifically, will this rule jeopardize short line operators' ability to stay in business?
Yeah, so I'll first speak to California short lines. The typical California short line is a very small business, small operator, operates on very thin margins. To propose, even with state and federal funding, to upgrade their locomotives to the level that the CARB rule is requiring in such an abrupt period of time, they just financially can't do it. They will go out of business. Losing those types of efficient and cost-effective freight options will take their customers' product to be moved at a much higher cost, and that absolutely would pass on a higher cost to the end user, to the customer. For my railroad, we would essentially, in order to comply, have to use all of our capital expenditure dollars, hopefully coupled with federal funding, to transfer and upgrade our current 11 locomotive fleet to Tier 4 fleet. What that does is it jeopardizes the other capital expenditure projects that we would have in place. Most of the projects that we deal with are crossing related and track related. Crossing related, you jeopardize the safety of the public. Thousands of cars in our community go over those crossings. You jeopardize the safety of our employees. And then on track upgrades, typically we're upgrading those tracks to handle heavier loads and to help get rid of the potential of derailments.
Thank you. You know, the feedback I'm getting from short line railroads that operate in Kansas is exactly that. It's going to, these are high capital, low margin businesses. And when you suck up all of their capital improvement dollars going towards just upgrading locomotives instead of making safety improvements on the track and other expansion, there's a cost to that for the overall society. No, I appreciate that. And by the way, short lines are telling me in Kansas, if this rule goes into effect, they will go out of business, which means all of our farmers and ranchers all of our farmers that are producing crops aren't going to have railheads to take their crop to, which means it's going to have to be trucked, which means more trucks on the road. If your only metric is the environment, it'll be bad for the environment, not to mention the fact it's going to dramatically increase our food prices. We've got to be thoughtful about these regulations. Quick question for you, Ms. Arias. You said earlier that you had no interest in mode shifts from rail to truck. Won't this rule do just that?
We don't believe so. We have looked at various analyses of mode shift. We've looked at various analyses of deferment of freight to other ports. We believe there is enough profit margin from a container moving on rail to allow for the upgrade of the technology. We also are very aware that there is almost a doubling of the amount of freight that is being projected to come through, and so we'll need all modes, but we need them to go to
Did your
zero.
analysis look into the safety concerns of this? In other words, when railroads have to divert so many capital dollars to upgrading their engines away from crossings and other things, did the safety aspect of this hit your analysis?
It did come up. The railroads provided that information to us, as well as provided it directly to our board.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Carter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. My district in southeast Louisiana, at the mouth of the Mississippi River, is a critical point for our national commerce. It's home to the Port of South Louisiana, one of the nation's leaders in total tonnage, as well as the Port of New Orleans, the only deep water port served by all 6 Class I railroads. Along with their neighboring deep water ports near the end of the river, they account for approximately 70% of our nation's grain exports, among other critical items. Continued rail operation through these ports is critical for both our local economy and the nation at large. However, we bear the scars of industry and commerce. While I completely support industry, we must continue finding ways to make it safer, cleaner for the people that live in its close proximity. I live in an area that unfortunately is sometimes referred to as, I represent rather, an area that's sometimes referred to as Cancer Alley, a distinction that we don't like, a distinction that we'd like to correct because of the large amount of petrochemical plants and industry and activity in that area. Neighbors are forced to live with things that many other neighbors are not. We know that many of these plants and entities that emit problematic carcinogens or problematic particulates are situated in poorer communities, communities of Black and brown. While I support trade and commerce, it cannot continue to be at the expense of the health of our communities. I'm committed to working with both industry to make sure that we have strong economies, but also making sure that we have healthy communities that are economically prosperous. So my question, Ms. Arias, freight train routes run through or parallel to communities of color and low-income communities, which bear disproportionate health burdens due to their proximity to toxic emissions from locomotives. However, according to the EPA, Tier 4 locomotives have 90% lower particulate matter emissions and 80% lower nitrogen oxide emissions than Tier 2. How have communities in California been impacted by the close proximity to these rail yards and rail lines, and how might this change with the implementation of cleaner locomotives?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Our communities, very much like your community, we see that 90% of the communities within 1 mile of our rail lines and our rail yards are our disproportionate communities of color. They are at higher risk of cancer. They are at higher risk of other health impacts associated with these diesel engines. All of our communities within the non-attainment areas are also impacted because this pollution does not stay local. It does go regional, also global issues. From our rule alone, we're hoping to be able to save 3,200 premature deaths. We're also hoping to save 1,500 ER visits and hospital visits. There are other benefits, as I mentioned earlier, a 90% reduction in exposure to these communities from this diesel toxic.
Is there a safe threshold for
There's
which
no safe threshold
people
to
can
diesel.
breathe particulate matter?
There's absolutely no safe threshold to diesel, which is why we need to transition to zero emission operations.
So when we talk about lowering, we talk about modifying, none of it is acceptable.
No,
Is that correct?
that's correct.
And while commerce is clearly important, and while industry is clearly important, nothing trumps the health of a community. Because if you have an unhealthy community, you cannot have a healthy economy. Mr. Olvera, you mentioned that Railline was the recent recipient of a CRISI grant funding to upgrade your locomotives to low-emitting Tier 4 vehicles. The CRISI program is now 4 times larger than before due to investments from the program of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Would you like to continue to see the program funded at the same level going forward? What would that mean for operators like you who are trying to lower their emissions?
So first off, it's essential for CRISI funding to continue and hopefully continue even at larger levels. Short
So
lines
that's
like
a yes, you do support it and you'd like to see it at higher levels?
absolutely support CRISI funding. The short answer for us is that we're unable to comply with the CARB rule without the assistance of CRISI funding. Even with that, it's a big financial burden on our company, and like I mentioned, other short lines just won't be able to comply. But it's estimated that short lines in the nation have about $12 billion of needed funds to upgrade infrastructure, rail assets, and modernize their railroads. And so in the most recent CRISI funding, there was a few $100 million that were allocated to short lines, which is much appreciated, but you can see the discrepancy between the current funding and the ultimate need. We need more, more often and more of it.
Some of my colleagues, they intimated that they were concerned about these regulations threatening to possibly shut you down. If you did not have access to CRISI funds, would that likely threaten you even further to being in demise?
Absolutely. I'll use an average of a new Tier 4 locomotive costs several millions of dollars. When we recently applied and was awarded CRISI funding, our portion is approximately $1 million. But on a standalone basis, if my railroad had to pay $4+ million for each of our 11 locomotives to be upgraded, it's just not feasible. We wouldn't be able to comply.
My time has expired. Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Yakum for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here and for the time to sound the alarm bell on this important issue. One of the reasons I love our system of government is that it empowers states to be laboratories of democracy, to experiment with new policies and see what works. My home state of Indiana has a proud tradition of innovative thinking that's allowed us to not just craft policies that work best for Hoosiers, but even to export some of these ideas to other states or even to the federal level. The Railroad Crossing Elimination Program is a great example of us doing just that. Now, California is a state base blessed with natural beauty and fertile agricultural land, but its laboratory has been littered with, frankly, terrible ideas. It spent $24 billion to fight homelessness over the last 5 years, but has no data on whether the money actually reduced homelessness. California's high-speed rail boondoggle was initially estimated to cost $33 billion, but nearly 20 years later, there's still no timeline for completion, and it might need another $100 billion. Its defund the police policies have hollowed out once bustling city centers, and it managed to turn a $100 billion budget surplus into a $45 billion deficit in just 2 years. That might be a record. What I don't want, and what Hoosiers in my district don't want, is to be subject to yet another one of California's unworkable radical climate mandates. Mr. Nober, CARB has said that Class 1 railroads like Union Pacific and BNSF will likely pass on the cost of compliance, which is upwards of $800 million per year, quote, across the nation. But CARB also argues that this mandate will only apply to California. Doesn't the fact that the costs will be spread beyond California mean that this rule impacts interstate commerce and is therefore preempted?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the rule impacts interstate commerce is in fact preempted, and I think much of the discussion you've heard today has been about the hope for national impact of this. And so that is, while maybe well-meaning, is exactly what this committee prohibited when it passed the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act and set the law out. Now, the fact that the costs would be spread nationwide and the benefits would be local is, probably further evidence of the fact that this is an interstate network system, and one that is very difficult to have stop at the state border, the same way that aircraft can't stop at the California state border and switch out their engines, just because that's just not the nature of interstate systems like this.
Thank you. And Mr. Olvera, CARB argues that freight rail operations like you should just raise rates to compensate for this new mandate. As a short-line operator, can you tell me what this mandate means to you, your company, and your workers in terms of inflation and employment?
Yeah, so my railroad is a handling carrier. We receive our freight rates from our Class 1 operators. So through contract provisions, our short line doesn't have the ability to raise rates to cover CARB regulation costs. So we would have no ability to do that. And the increase in rail freight, if it happens from this CARB rule, which it's been said that it will absolutely happen, then our market competitors, trucking, would have more of an advantage against the railroad and further hurt our business and our ability to achieve profits and growth.
Thank you. And Mr. Yall, do you generally agree with Mr. Olvera's assessment?
Yes, I do. In fact, the point about these costs, their ability to do capital improvements, safety improvements, and operational improvements, and those budgets go into this instead of going into, from our side, the construction jobs and projects that we rely on. That is also a very real issue, and like Mr. Olvera said, it's just going to shift over to trucking. That's all that's going to happen.
Thank you. And Mr. Olvera, is this technology mandated by this rule readily available and feasible for short-line railroads to acquire?
Did you say electric vehicles?
No, for short-line railroads to acquire. Is the technology readily available and feasible for you to acquire?
So first off, on the Tier 4 side, it's there's one U.S. manufacturer, Cummins, and those engines are limited in inventory and manufacturing. And as railroads rush to upgrade, that inventory is going to be depleted. In terms of battery-charged locomotives, those are in prototype stages. As it was called out earlier, there might be a railroad that has one or two in some version of testing, but in terms of it being commercially available, that is not the case. Worse off, for the concept of a battery-charged locomotive, that requires maybe 24 hours of charging for 8 hours of use. My diesel engine runs 24/7. So if I were to replace a diesel engine with a battery-operated locomotive, I may need 2 or 3 battery-operated locomotives to accommodate that change with a further larger cost and not a limited ability to comply.
And finally, it would be accurate to say then that they are mandating that you buy something that does not yet exist.
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Burlinson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Olvera. The freight rail industry is the most fuel-efficient way of transporting goods across the country. And as we've heard today, even Republicans and Democrats agree that it's the cleanest form of transportation in the country. One would think that we would want to encourage a migration towards, anyone who would care about the environment would want to migrate, would want to move freight to rail. Why do you think that what do you think is the real motivation behind this mandate?
I think one of the biggest issues with the mandate is that there haven't been data analyzed for those who are impacted to truly understand all of the impacts of this cleaner air initiative. Short lines, in mine included, are not opposed to cleaner locomotives, but the time frame in which we're asked to do this and before certain technology is commercially available is just not a possibility for us to comply. So I think, so yes, we're all for.
So you're saying this is out of a motivation of an idealistic pipe dream? That's what I would call it.
It's aspirational at best. Everybody would be for it, but the way to get there is not what's being proposed to the CARB rule.
I would say the efforts are delusional at best. So let me ask it in a different way. These efforts are almost so extreme. It has me wondering if there's some rent seeking occurring, if companies. The few companies that make these tier 4, class 4 engines like KLW, Siemens, EMD, Brookville, I wonder, do they have a relationship with the California Air Resource Board?
I'm uncertain what to ask the CARB representative, but I can't speak to that.
But you're saying that, so to get a better idea, the cost, what I see what's frustrating, and Mrs. Arias, I'm not asking a question, I'm just talking to you, is that what's absurd is what California doesn't see that's happening. Across the country, states like Missouri are receiving people who are fleeing like refugees, this draconian state, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of people a year. They're coming at a net loss. California is reducing its size. And why? Because the costs of living are outrageous compared the most expensive state in the contiguous 48. Whether you're talking at all factors, transportation costs, the most expensive state, housing costs, food costs, everything is more expensive in California. And all you have to do is look at the people that are regulating the hell out of the costs. So, Mr. Nober, one might wonder, if you're trying to improve the supply chain, if you're trying to reduce costs, would this be a good avenue to do that?
Well, I would come back to the point you made a little bit earlier, Congressman, which is that it's requiring the adoption of technology by a date certain that doesn't exist. And what winds up happening is that deters the adoption of new technology because businesses don't know if what they're buying is going to be they're going to amortize it over its useful life. And so, I think Mr. Olvera spoke earlier about having bought Tier 3 locomotives and halfway through their useful life, they're now going to be not useful and have to upgrade to Tier 4. And I think folks looking at this regulation might say, why would we invest in any, I'm just speculating, but why would we invest in any locomotive until there are working zero-emission locomotives that are operable in the demands of freight rail, which is 24/7 by 365. And the technological hurdles for that are significant, and I don't think there is an end date for when that kind of technology will be available.
And the sad part is that the reach, you have these refugees who have migrated to states like Missouri and fleeing all of this regulatory state, and yet now the arm of these California regulators are going to impact people across the United States financially.
I think that will be either a goal or certainly an effect of the regulation.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Well, Mr. Oliveira, let's start with you, my fellow Modestoite. How long have you been in Modesto?
Pretty much all my life.
Fantastic. You look a little younger than me. Remember a few things in Beard Industrial Tract where you worked that aren't there anymore. I know Tri-Valley Growers has been reformed as Signature Food Products. Signature Foods, another major cannery for peaches, is gone. Del Monte's still there, but we're losing them. I mean, in fact, I just pulled up, my grandfather was a peach grower right there along the Santa Fe Railroad lines. I Didn't like the train whistles, but I never felt as dying from them. I think we've been on that property for 5 generations, right a mile away from the Beard Industrial Tract as farmers. And we're losing a lot of commerce in Modesto. We're losing it. And it's sad because, as we know, Modesto's got the Modesto Irrigation District, the second oldest irrigation district in the state. 1889, I think it was formed, right after Turlock in 1888. We've got hydroelectric power. We've got fresh surface water. We've got the infrastructure of both the railroads that you serve, to the east and to the west of you, which is critical. And that's why we have the largest canneries, the largest wineries, the largest spaghetti sauce makers. We got the highest tech Frito-Lay plant. Went out there and saw the Tesla trucks and all the... But right now, the United States produces 0.66% of the world's canned peaches. It's fallen 16.99% in the last year, and Brazil and Netherlands have gone up. Now, I've always taken pride that Modesto feeds the world. And I've taken pride that we have a local food system. Is cutting the last speck of emissions a bigger health priority than a diverse, nutritious diet for Americans, especially a locally or domestically produced, food-secure, domestic diet for Americans, working families especially? I ask that rhetorically to someone. No, we're giving up enormous food resources out of America because of these onerous, idiotic regulatory programs. And Mr. Nober's done a good job today explaining how, by doing this through a waiver, this is establishing national policy that disrupts our food supply in one of our most critical food-producing regions in the nation, while avoiding the due process that we normally afford. If we had due process, we could take into account the dietary needs of American families and balance them against the air quality needs of American families. But we chose not to do that because we found a loophole. Right, Ms. Arias? Wasn't this convenient not to have to weigh these matters?
No, that is never our intention to ignore impacts associated with the rule. And as we go through our 6-year process, we're always interested in any of the impacts associated with our rules.
A 6-year impact where we know that Tier 4 engines are going to be able to reduce 9/10 of the air emissions that the Tier 0 did that Mr. Oliver invested. You invested in Tier 3 and now you're getting your first Tier 4s.
Yes.
We are saying, well, we're agnostic as to whether we go from rail to truck or not, even though trucks are 3x the emissions per ton of food delivered per mile as rail. But in California, we also know if we'd had a full, transparent public policy process and hearing on this, we'd know that California's not building freeways. Highway 5 was built when I was born in 1966. It's 2 lanes each direction from the Bay Area down to Bakersfield. We're building warehouses all up and down that corridor, and we're not building freeways. We're barely widening 99 to help people get to work. This is our food valley. This is the San Joaquin Valley, the fruit bowl of the nation. We're not building the trucks we need. We're outlawing the trains we need. We're weighing the last air quality increment over affordability. Do you believe, Mrs. Arias, that diet is a key health factor for working families, low-income families, all families, color, I don't care. Everybody needs a healthy and diverse diet, an affordable diet.
Yes, as an ag business major from Chico, I can tell you that the agricultural production in our state is very important.
Did that show up in your public comment policy, program on this policy proposal?
What do you mean, sir?
Did it show up? Did people say, we need a domestic, diverse, nutritious food supply? We need a logistic system that will actually meet the needs of a diverse food supply? Or was that bypassed by you going through a waiver and then calculating the benefits nationally, but not taking public input
No,
on
sir.
the
The
cost?
ag industry was very vocal about the necessity to be able to continue to produce agriculture as we promulgated the rule.
And did they agree with your idea that the last 1% of emissions needed to be eliminated and that the balance of human health would be benefited by increasing the cost of food, pushing trucks onto overcrowded freeways that we have a policy in California not to increase the capacity of?
The ag industry did not come in supportive all the way through of the rule. Yes, they are concerned about the movement of their product, but we are talking about 1/3 of the emissions necessary to meet the Clean Air Act.
9/10 of which you could achieve with Tier 4 engines, and another 3/4 you can take out by not pushing it onto the freeways.
We certainly are interested in Tier 4 engines. The industry has
gavel
told us
myself.
they are not, and if they were to
Thank you.
purchase a Tier 4 engine, they can continue to utilize it well into the 2050s.
Thank you. I'll yield back, and I'll recognize who's that? Mr. Fong? Mr. Kai. I'm sorry. I'll recognize Mr. Fong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the witnesses for being here. Ms. Arias, good to see you. I recently got elected and served in the State Assembly on the Transportation Committee and on the Select Committee on Ports and Goods Movement. So let me ask this question. In 2005, CARB entered into a voluntary agreement with BNSF and UP to reduce emissions at rail yards. The agreement stated, quote, "The parties recognize that participating railroads are federally regulated and that aspects of state and local authority to regulate railroads are preempted." It further stated, quote, "The Federal Clean Air Act, the Interstate Commerce Termination Act, and many other laws establish a uniform federal system of equipment and operational requirements." At that time, CARB acknowledged federal preemption. So what's changed since then?
Yes, thank you for that question. The biggest change is the technology that's available today. When you look at the opportunity to reconfigure the existing engines with the battery tenders or catenary, that was not an option before, and it is today. That allows us to access our authority to be able to promulgate a rule for in-use. We are not regulating the engine manufacturers. In some cases, they are providing zero-emission technology, but that is not because of our rule. The ability to be able to change the power source of an already electric engine is relatively new and something that now gives us the ability to do an in-use role.
So I would say that we can't look at this regulation and this issue in a vacuum. CARB is imposing mandates and regulations on all aspects of the supply chain. So we're discussing the rail impacts. CARB has imposed mandates on the trucking industry. CARB is imposing significant mandates on the ports. So together, all of these regulations have devastating impacts on our nation's distribution of goods and products. So my question is, how does the state of California plan to mitigate these supply chain disruptions that are clearly acknowledged and there's a consensus on? And what does CARB say to the consumer when they have to pay more for goods and products?
Yeah, good question. We have, over the years, heard of many concerns related to our rules and how it is going to cause diversion of our freight and how it will disrupt the supply chain. However, we have also successfully seen these rules be implemented without supply chain diversion and without supply chain disruptions. Our port continues to be the largest ports in the nation. We continue to process the largest amount of containers for the nation. We continue to provide a lot of food for the nation,
Let me just
all
say
while
that-
being able to transition to a cleaner freight transport system.
Let me just say, though, I apologize for interrupting, but that empirically is not true. The California ports are losing significant market share to other ports. As mentioned before by the other witnesses, goods and products are now not coming to California. They're going to other states, other ports, and you now are mandating, so our trucking industry can't get engines. Our railroads are struggling to afford new engines that technically are not feasible at this moment. And then the ports are being mandated to the point where probably they can't, there's gonna be a volume cap on what goes into the ports, and all of those containers are gonna go to other states. So empirically, what you're saying is not true. And the supply chain inflation that has existed has occurred in the past with the supply chain crisis that happened through the pandemic. Consumers paid more. So how does the state of California tell the average consumer they're gonna pay more based on this regulation?
We have published data that shows that this regulation could cost each household $36 a year. And as a point to the ports, they have actually been having record-breaking years. Yes, there is some diversion of discretionary containers, but the actual containers coming through are much higher than they've ever been, and we continue to project that they will actually double within the next several decades.
So does your assessment take into account all of these regulations together, or you're just
Correct.
taking, or you're taking this into account for
Oh,
just,
the $36,
Yeah.
sir? No, the $36 is just this reg,
just for rail?
per year, per household.
Right, so if you add in the trucking regulations, you add in the port regulations, you add in all the regulations to the entire supply chain, the system of systems that moves products. 40% of the goods and products that come into the United States of America come to the port of LA and Long Beach. So does your analysis take into account all of these regulations layered on top of each other to the impact to the average consumer?
No, we have not done an analysis that shows the total monetized benefits that we receive from all these rules compared to the cost per household of these rules.
As a Californian, I would say that when it comes to strengthening our supply chain, California is not the model.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Kiley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Arias, you're with CARB. You're the chief of the Transportation and Toxics Division, correct?
Correct.
Thank you for being here with us today. But I did have to ask, are you an elected official?
I am not.
Is anyone at CARB an elected official?
Some of our board members are, yes.
But are they acting in a elected capacity when they make policy at CARB?
They are, some of them are elected, but they are all appointed by our Senate and governor.
They're appointed, not elected.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, they originally may be elected
So you
officials.
took this opportunity upon yourselves to issue this new regulation banning non-electric trains, is that correct?
The staff promulgated the rule and took it to the board for their consideration, and they adopted
So
it.
it wasn't voted on by the legislature?
It was not.
It wasn't voted on by the people of California?
It was not.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm very glad you called this hearing because we have really a crisis of democratic legitimacy in California, where we have an agency, a massive bureaucracy, CARB, that is making tectonic changes to our society, not just in California, but across the country, without any measure of democratic accountability, and is enacting harebrained scheme after harebrained scheme that wouldn't even survive whatever modicum of rationality might be present in the supermajority legislature. And it's having dramatic impacts on our state. I mean, you could flip through the pages of dystopian fiction and not find an entity quite like CARB in terms of just how completely out of control and disconnected from the real world it has become. And I think that this regulation under consideration today, banning non-electric trains, is a perfect example of that. So Mr. Alveria, you testified about how currently railroads are already the most environmentally friendly way to transport freight across the country, correct?
That's correct. Today, railroads contribute 2% of transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, while our competitor trucking contributes 23%.
And you've also testified that the technology to comply with this regulation is not currently in existence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that because of this, short lines such as your company or others may be forced to shut down. Is that correct?
That's correct. To comply with the CARB rule as written, many short lines in the state of California cannot comply. They'd go bankrupt. And as I explained, my railroad, we'd have to defer lots of other safety-driven projects in order to comply with the locomotive upgrade.
So this would shift freight to from more environmentally friendly to less environmentally friendly modes of transport. Is
That's
that correct?
correct. It'd push more to truck and have a worse impact on emissions.
So the whole purpose of this regulation, the ostensible purpose, which is to reduce emissions, would actually do just the opposite. Is it a self-undermining, self-defeating regulation? But of course, it does a lot more than that in terms of the collateral damage or costs. You testified that this would raise costs for consumers, correct?
That's correct.
Making the experience of inflation worse in California and across the country. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
And in addition to that, you'd have more vehicles on the road, which would create more traffic for drivers, I assume.
More traffic, more congestion, and there was 6,000 deaths related to heavy trucks last year, and that's been increasing year over year. To put more trucks on our roads, that number unfortunately would probably increase.
So more wear and tear on the roads, more accidents, more injuries, more death.
That's correct.
And then you've also testified, Mr. Yall, about some of the other costs in terms of construction costs, correct?
That's correct.
Is it fair to say that this regulation, by increasing the cost of construction, both in terms of the cost of materials and the cost of their transport, would increase the already high cost of housing in California?
That's correct, yes.
And you also testified that it would make it more difficult for us to build new infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yes, our concern is that the funds that both from passenger rail operators and freight rail operators that would have been used for capital improvements, which is what we do, what our industry does, is going to get diverted to this effort, and there will be a significant decrease in available funding through that, in addition to making the cost of projects bigger and more expensive, so your dollar goes just less further.
So if I have this right, we have an unelected, not democratically accountable body that has decided on its own to make policy not just for California, but effectively for the entire country, and has done so in the name of reducing emissions, but has come up with a policy that will actually increase emissions, while also increasing costs and inflation for consumers by putting more vehicles on the road, creating more traffic, creating more wear and tear on our roads, reducing our road quality, creating more accidents, meaning more injuries and more death, increasing the cost of construction, increasing the costs of housing, and making it more difficult to build new infrastructure. I'm glad we had this hearing, Mr. Chair, because I think this is exactly the wrong policy for California and for our country. I yield back.
Gentlemen yield back. We now recognize Mr. Molinaro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do feel a little bit out of place as a New Yorker, but I will offer to you that when California or New York institute rules or regulations or new policy, the rest of the country should likely be afraid. Ms. Arias, I don't want to take issue with where California is as it relates to your economic activity. The state represents 14.5% of the entire national economy, but I do want to tell you the tale of once being the empire. I serve in a state that once was the largest population in the nation, was the largest economy in the nation, once was the ultimate location for cultural and economic activity, once. It's actually one of the reasons that we're referred to as the Empire State. We built the Midwest thanks to the great work of the Erie Canal and others. But now we lead the nation in outmigration. More people leave the state of New York to every other state in the nation than any other state in the nation. We shoulder the highest burden of taxation of any people in the country, even more than California. And the answer as to why is because policymakers, elected and appointed, establish rules and regulations that are unachievable without consideration for the actual impact to the end user being the citizen, the taxpayer, the consumer. You referenced, Ms. Arias, that your analysis, the CARB's analysis, is simply that there may be disruptions to the supply chain, but they're surmountable in the near term. Is that about right?
No, we didn't talk about disruption in the supply chain for this. I was referring to the overall supply chain. Sorry if that was.
So you acknowledge that this regulation, this rule, disrupts the supply chain?
No, I would say it transforms the supply chain.
It's a lovely word that even I use. I love it because it avoids the actual truth, which is disruption is what happens in order for transformation to occur if you can achieve it. But we recognize it's very hard to achieve the goal. In New York, thanks to California, New York, in establishing the climate leadership policy, CLCPA, uses basically the same standard. It looks across the river and says, we're going to cross this wild, roaring river, but we're not going to tell you how to build the bridge, and we don't even care if you can build a bridge. It's an absurd kind of governance. If we want to get to the kind of economic and environmental benefit that perhaps policies like this seem to want to achieve, you must have the path to get there, and you can't get there from here. Mr. Olvera, just a few moments ago, Ms. Arias did suggest that this rule, this rule would have a de minimis impact on families across America. I think she said $36 a year. First, I will offer to you that can't be possible. And second, I would offer to you, Mr. Olvera, that I don't judge what people can or cannot afford. I always appreciate when, and I mean no disrespect, I was once an appointed official as well, but I always appreciate when people who aren't elected say to other people who have to pay the bills, it really won't cost you that much. It's sort of like when you say to your kid, it's going to hurt me more than it hurts you. I get that 36 doesn't sound like a lot of money. It's impossible that that's a limited impact. But without question, I'm not going to judge what people can or cannot afford. CARB's own analysis suggests that this rule in and of itself creates an $86 billion in nationwide compliance costs, and that, of course, these costs are going to disrupt, transform, and impact the supply chain. Can you speak to sort of humanize this? How do we expect the CARB rule to impact the cost of, let's say, groceries to the average American family?
Sure. So today, rail is a very cost-efficient freight option for our customers. I've heard from different customers at times the savings by going through rail freight versus truck freight is 3 to 4 times less. So that freight option, the rail freight option, if it was removed and mandated that our customers had to use a higher expense to move their goods, that decreases their bottom line, and the only way to make up for that is to pass on cost to the customer. That would absolutely increase cost of goods to the end user.
Sure. And I remember not being here in Congress when the other side of the aisle did control both houses of the legislature, imposed the Inflation Reduction Act, and I remember elected and bureaucratic leaders suggesting there'd be no impact on inflation, and yet we experienced the highest rate of inflation in 40 years. I know, Mr. Olvera, and I won't ask you to answer this again, but you spoke to the impact that this rule has on smaller Class 2 and 3 railroads. In fact, the rule itself could exceed their annual operating budgets and likely result in the decline of those operations. I don't want to. I have 30 seconds. So, Mr. Nober, I just want to reference for you. Obviously, other states can impose, and states like New York have imposed similar rules as it relates to vehicle emissions. Can you just suggest to us what are the potential impacts? Let's say if New York were to, with a single party governing, Democratic Party governing in New York, what would happen if New York were to adopt a similar rule?
Well, I mean, it would again create the kinds of problems that you don't want to see in interstate commerce, which is different operating rules and requirements in different states, so that you can't have interoperable equipment between over the 50 states, and that kind of flies in the face of interstate commerce. So that would create more and more patchwork issues, and would show why this is preempted.
Thank you, Mr. Nober. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee not been recognized? We have 8 minutes. We are voting right now, so we have 8 minutes for the members to get over there. I want to have a second round. I want to respect the hell out of the gentleman to right, Mr. LaMalfa, but I don't know. I tell you what, Mr. LaMalfa, you've got 2 minutes. Oh, no, 2 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it greatly. Ms. Arias, have you taken into account if the requirement with 65% of the locomotive fleet will be banned by the year 2030? We've heard repeatedly that the technology for Tier 4, let alone the later tiers, isn't even working yet to any extent to replace that many locomotives. We heard General Van Ovest, who is the head of the U.S. Transportation Command for our military vehicles. Have you taken into account the effect of being able to deploy military vehicles and equipment across the country where it needs to be in this study, in this idea? Because if we can't move that because an electric train can only go 100 miles or something, what's going to happen with that? Have you taken that into account as well as perishable ag goods?
Yes, military is exempt.
And they said it's okay?
Yes.
All right.
Military is exempt from the rule.
Oh, they're exempt from it? Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Olvera, touch on, please, to wrap it up, on the available, we've heard it glossed over. Oh, we have the technology. We'll just take the Tier 3 or 4 diesel engine out and put electric in, basically. How is that even close to practical?
The electric locomotive is not currently commercially available. And As I mentioned before, the replacement of an electric vehicle replacing a diesel locomotive is completely different. Charge time on a battery-operated locomotive is 24 hours for 8 hours of use. My diesel engine runs 24/7. I may need 2 to 3 electric locomotives to replace one diesel engine.
So to replace 65% of the locomotives by 2030, no way, right? Quickly.
I don't see how that's commercially feasible and possible.
Mr. Yall, we're talking about this special account where they want to take mass amounts of money from the railroad operators and put it into a special account that is unavailable for capital for you. You have a very big project that is being looked at in Barstow, which would massively increase efficiency for railroads. What is this special account thing tying up all your finances going to do to you?
The project is a $1.5 billion intermodal railroad facility. It's to be built by BNSF, and the concern is that the spending account is going to divert resources from BNSF's capital improvement fund, which funds these intermodal facilities. This one and there
Quickly,
are
because it means you're probably not going to build it because your money's all tied up?
That's what we're hearing, yes.
Yeah, so we're going to lose efficiency of that new project. Yeah.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate the indulgence. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yields. Mr. DeSantier is going to get the last word. You have a minute.
Mr. gave me a chance to have more time. Just briefly, there are elected officials on CARB. There always has been. It's required by the California Clean Air Act. Again, Ronald Reagan is governor. I was one of those representing the districts.
Correct.
Number two, just because CARB passes this doesn't mean that every state has to go on it as well.
And
They
in
have to
fact, we've never had any other state pick up our off-road rules.
Right. So they have to go through their own legislative
Correct.
process and then ask for, so if it's a national trend, it's not by statute.
Correct.
Thirdly, you're doing what you're required by statute because you have to comply and get these reductions. You can also use the alternative plan to get to those reductions.
Correct.
So all of those things I just wanted to clear up. And thank you, Mr. LaMalfa and the chairman for letting me talk.
You're absolutely. Any further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing. I'd like to thank each one of you for being here. I thought this was very informative, very insightful, and thank you for your testimony. The subcommittee stands adjourned.